Hello, team, and welcome to our second lecture of week 6. Thank you again for joining me. Last lecture, we had a look at the Soviet Union and went to the causes of its collapse. This time, we'll be looking slightly west towards the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia and touching on its collapse in a much more brief fashion than we did with the Soviet Union. And then we'll be connecting the Yugoslav collapse and the resultant wars in that region with the restructuring of the post-Soviet economy in the early 1990s, which will then take us up to the Asian financial crisis. And that's where we'll end this week, which has been obviously a very looking at a very tumultuous and difficult period in the global political economy at this time. So let's begin. We've already gone through the learning objectives in the last lecture, as well as the required readings, and let's get straight into it. So here you can see I've put a map of the former Republic of Yugoslavia and its constituent states. And this area is called the Adriatic Rim of southeastern Europe, which is roughly from Albania to Slovenia. And this area and a lot of histories has been characterized, I guess, by its subjugation to imperial control, the mass movement and settlement of migrants in this area, and in spite of lots of prolonged periods of military activity, a resistance to building a robust state system in conformity with the Western model. Now, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I led to the creation of a kingdom of many nationalities, which was called the South Slav Union, or Yugoslavia. This dynastic dictatorship disintegrated during World War II with Nazi occupation, and then Yugoslavia was subdivided into its constituent parts by the Germans. Now, after the liberation of this area from Nazi Germany, which was led by communist partisans under Josip Broz or Tito, Yugoslavia established a political system bound mainly by national militaries, command economies, and political dictatorship. Tito's Yugoslavia enjoyed a degree of economic prosperity and a non-alignment policy that facilitated Western trade, investment, and tourism. And by the time of Tito's death in 1980, the country's political cohesion had begun to fragment, which is a major focus for us today. A new constitution, which was designed in 1974, created an 8-member federal presidency with a rotating chair in Yugoslavia. At this stage, this was now 6 years before Tito's death, it decentralized every state function except defense and foreign policy. But this also started to create a alternative power base that challenged the federal Yugoslav control. Confronted with a dual transition after the Cold War to both political pluralism and capitalism, the Yugoslav state community didn't have the sufficient social, political, and institutional capacities at its disposal to democratically resolve the impending political economy crisis, which we'll be touching on today. At this time, and assisted by the contradictions of political decentralization and economic centralization, which we'll touch on, there was the rapid consolidation of leaders such as Milan Kukan in Slovenia, Franjo Tudjman in Croatia, and Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, which signaled the end of federalism in Yugoslavia. The autonomy of many previous autonomous regions, such as Kosovo, was revoked, which caused widespread unrest. And then by the beginning of 1990, Milosevic became president of Serbia. Slovenia, which is the most ethnically homogenous republic, took steps towards independence, and then extremists in the Croat Democratic Union gained ground in Croatia. And then in 1990, highly nationalist elements came to power. Now, let's talk a little bit more now how that spiraled into war. And then, so we're kind of, I guess, taking a little bit of a roundabout way. I'm going to talk mostly initially now focusing on the rise of nationalism in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, which had its constituent states as indicated by the previous slide here, and how these states started to get more political power through decentralization, which had started under Tito in the mid-1970s. And then I'll talk a little bit more how this nationalism developed and fostered before we'll then backtrack a little bit to then talk about the political economy of the disintegration. So at the moment, we're kind of almost following quite a orthodox, perhaps, nationalist reading of the crisis. Now, Bosnia, as one of the constituent parts of the Yugoslav federal system, was designated a republic with no nation of its own, and it instead had three constituent nations, which were defined by its ethnicities. There was both Serb, Croat, and Muslim peoples in Bosnia. Now, as Yugoslavia disintegrated, these three communities elected three very nationalist leaders to a power-sharing government. With the president of the mainly Muslim area as the overall president of the three. In 1991, the formal declarations of independence started to pick up pace in Yugoslavia. Macedonia declared its independence without any resistance. Then Slovenia and Croatia followed suit. And Slovenia successfully repelled the remaining Yugoslav National Army, which was mostly constituted in Serbia as the republic disintegrated. But Croatia met full resistance and full-scale assaults from the Yugoslav National Army. And then Serbs in a certain area of Croatia declared an autonomous region in response to denial of citizen rights by the Zagreb nationalist government, and they began an armed struggle as well. Then in early 1992, the Bosnian government threatened as well to pull out of the Yugoslav Federation. And then as soon as that happened, the ethnic government of the Serb Democratic Party, which was led by Radovan Karadzic, declared independence, as then did the Croat Democratic Union for the Croat statelet of Herzegovina. Now, just as peacekeepers from the UN started to arrive in Croatia in response to some temporary ceasefires that were agreed between the fledgling Croatian state and the Yugoslav National Forces, violence started to spread to Bosnia. In April of 1992, the European community then recognized the independence of Bosnia, even though it started to break up and violence escalated, and even as a political community, it started to cease to exist at that stage. Then for 3.5 years, regulars, militias, and guerrilla forces fought localized by interconnected wards around the Bosnian region, frequently committing atrocities against civilians. To begin with, Bosnian Serbs, supported by Belgrade, fought Muslims and Croats. But then in 1993, the Croats, which were supported from Zagreb, from Croatia proper, turned on Muslim civilians in Mostar, Dalmatia, and central Bosnia. And then the United States at this time started to lead with initiatives to bring Croats and Muslims together in Bosnia and stop their fighting, who wanted to turn the military balance against the Serbs. The 1994 Washington Agreement created a Croat-Bosniak Federation, which undermined the Croat nationalist aspirations within Bosnia, but it guaranteed a confederation between the small federation of Croats in Bosnia and Croatia proper. Bosnian Serbs then founded their own unit in response, the Republic Srpska, and then peacekeepers from the UN and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees struggled to maintain humanitarian relief supply and to cope with the now ongoing wholesale displacement of people by escalating violence. The UN created safe areas in Bosnian cities of Sarajevo and other besieged urban areas, and they proved to be, contradictory in terms, because defending them cost the UN its neutrality, and member states only provide a very small number of troops as compared to what was requested by the UN Secretary General. And this then led to the humiliating fall of Srebrenica, which was protected by UN forces, and then the subsequent massacre of Bosniaks by Serb forces in July 1993, as well as the horrific attacks on a marketplace in Sarajevo in February 1994, which were important turning points as the violence, especially against Bosnian civilians, escalated. NATO eventually became increasingly systematic in its air attacks after it joined the war, and especially against Republic Srpska positions. And by the summer of 1995, Britain, France, and the Netherlands sent combat-capable rapid reaction forces to the area. The Republic Srpska parliament voted a plan to allow for itself as an autonomous entity to be constituted within a larger state, which then really upset the Serb leader, Slobodan Milosevic. And in response, he then announced a blockage of Bosnian Serbs in August 1994. But it wasn't until a US-backed Croatian offensive against the Serbs in Croatia in August 1995 started to produce a herding stalemate for most parties in the area. And that forced many of them to negotiating table, where the Dayton Accords were signed in December of 1995. And a NATO-led implementation force was set up to secure and stabilize the fragmented Bosnian Republic. So this is a very, very, very incredibly brief overview of some key points of the Bosnian War and some of the dynamics of it. But most of our focus here is on the political economy. So this is just a very brief excursion into it. But I would recommend you looking at the recommended resources for more information, and then also the sources that those authors touch on. So now we're going to look at the explanation of the Bosnian War and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which is kind of our main focus here. The conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, and especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, were predominantly portrayed as resulting from historic, century-old ethnic hatred, which had finally ruptured when Tito died and his control over Yugoslavia dissipated. Now, this was quite unsurprising as far as explanation goes, because what the world saw in the Bosnian War was the awful ethnic cleansing and genocide, especially of Bosnians, which were the really dramatic and horrific manifestations of the conflict. Its ghastly immediacy transferred to print and screen by the media that a lot of people saw. And in dominant popular and political interpretations, the bewildering descent into this kind of savagery was structured around what many commentators called a witch's brew of ethnic Slav nationalities. Observers concluded that Southeastern Europe was reverting to, its archetype, which was intractable violence nursed by ethnic ancient cleavages. While in slightly more sophisticated accounts, the conflict was archived as a narrative of dysfunctional constituents in which the nationalities question had remained stubbornly unresolved throughout the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. And then even more other commentators still, had admitted that Yugoslavia's ethnic and national groups had lived harmoniously for years and indeed intermarried, but contended that the shaping and manipulation of identity through the political discourse of extreme nationalism was able to mobilize groups for conflict. The kind of ethnic problematization of the conflict profoundly then affected the construction of external policy responses to it. Initially, this representation of the Balkans, which is a term already synonymous with endemic instability, induced caution among external actors about getting involved and sending peacekeepers, which is why we saw, a lot less peacekeepers than asked for that went to Bosnia, how they were very hesitant in actually being properly engaged. And then it allowed a lot of extremists to determine the nature of the problem in terms of ethnicity and territory through hate speech. Which was inflammatory denigration directed at other nationalities in the region. Then as a result, diplomatic efforts to end the war focused on constitutional arrangements and territorial subdivisions that embodied the very nexus between identity and territory on which the protagonists of the war relied upon. And then drawing and redrawing maps became a preoccupation that squeezed non-ethnic solutions out of contention. And even this, like the fixation of ethnic cartography, provided the antagonist of the war even with an incentive to continue to fight to win more ethnic space and ethnically displace more people of other ethnic groups to then justify their control of territory. Now, both the orthodox narrative of ethnic hatred and its variants, whether that's constitutional dysfunction, sorry, my dyslexia dysfunction, and political manipulation, masked other factors and external responsibilities that had contributed to the trajectory of the conflicts and their regional dimensions. The political manipulation variant of the ethnicity narrative pinned responsibility almost exclusively on Indigenous agency, particularly that of the Serb nationalists. And in doing so, it fostered silences around the economic sources of the conflict. And the economic issues here, which we're really interested in, did not fit neatly into an analytical framework that corralled the Yugoslavs into a zone of nationalist unrest governed by political opportunists. So now let's look more into this political economy of Yugoslavia, because that will help us understand then the disintegration and then the causes of war. Now, Yugoslavia's integration with the global economy was instrumental in shaping the trajectory of its economic collapse prior to and during the country's dissolution. Many more recent scholars now contend, for example, that economic collapse began in the 1970s when communist and nationalist elites opted for fragmented integration into the capitalist system. In Tito's last year at this time, the formal economy entered a structural crisis as it attempted to cope with the global depression related to the Vietnam War and the oil crisis, which we spoke about in the first lecture here and also last week. Now, in response to these crises in the 1970s, the government sought a World Bank structural adjustment loan of about $250 million in 1980, and that was supposed to finance imports that would be processed for re-export. This was also accompanied by austerity measures that severely reduced domestic purchasing powers. And then with export earnings reduced because, other foreign markets were also in recession around this time, and then expatriate remittances were static because Yugoslav workers were finding it, really difficult to get work abroad. The country then entered a balance of payments crisis where they had more debt than, money that they earned, and they turned to the International Monetary Fund in 1984. The loan from the IMF was intended to be used to repay its foreign debt, but the interest on it had ballooned during the various oil crises and economic crises that were ongoing. The IMF then agreed to postpone a US $2 billion debt repayment in return for the devaluation of the currency, pricing at market rates, removal of subsidies, and a major lowering of social consumption in the Republic of Yugoslavia. Later programs, still by the IMF, capped wages, reorientated production towards export, which could compete in European markets, re-centralized political and economic decision-making. Importantly, even though there was political decentralization, they called for privatization and currency deregulation. All these reforms were always presented as purely economic and technical, but the changes that were required by the IMF were fraught with political implications. Both directly and indirectly, the IMF reshaped Yugoslav politics throughout the 1980s into the 1990s. The direct restructuring of Yugoslav politics occurred through the imposition of conditions that required constitutional and institutional reforms. And the IMF began to condition access to more money for Yugoslavia on such reforms. Now, the first change required by the IMF related to this re-centralization, which I mentioned, or the shifting of political and especially economic authority from republican governments of the constituent republics in the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia back to the federal government and the Yugoslav National Bank. economists considered that the decentralization of policy making amongst the Yugoslav republics that had occurred in the mid-1970s was responsible for Yugoslavia's weak macroeconomic control. And accordingly, the IMF conditions attached to the use of their money after 1982 include a requirement for a federal reassertion of economic authority over Republican governments. So in a kind of interesting turn of events, it was capitalist international institutions demanding more centralized socialist control, or at least centralized government control in the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Now, further political change were attached to conditions that were part of IMF packages in the late 1980s. There were particularly May measures of 1988, which required basically the destruction of the socialist system of worker participation in firm decision-making, which had been quite an innovative focus of Yugoslav economy at that time, where the workers participated in company decision-making. There was demands for the removal of procedural protections against unemployment, the cutting of public expenditure. And with these austerity politics, there was then rebalancing of economic growth, where the engines of economic growth in the Yugoslav Republic started to be more focused on wealthy areas, like already wealthy areas, and especially, for instance, in like Croatia and Slovenia, which are more interconnected with Western Europe. And nationalistic politics emerged in these wealthy areas because they also started to see themselves as carrying the entire socialist Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. So there's quite a lot of resentment in these richer areas, interestingly enough. And the IMF was supporting this through structural adjustment, which sped the Croatian and Slovenian integration into Western Europe. And then contradictorily, or at the same time at least, structural adjustment programs were applied in the poorer areas of Yugoslavia, and these areas started to collapse under the harsh demands of austerity. And then the bureaucrats and politicians from this area started to see their role as protecting the local autonomy from the re-centralization demanded by the IMF that was ironically required to implement these austerity measures. These kind of economic transformations in line with this idea of integration with the capitalist global economy started to produce these structurally embedded like economic warfares between the constituent republics well before the actual physical violence started. The integration as well of Communist Party chiefs, state functionaries, and managers into the decentralized system started to facilitate as well the unleashing of plundering practices by authoritarian elites who seized the opportunities of market economics to carve up social property. Wage cuts also meant that purchasing power in Yugoslavia as a whole fell by 30%. And then by 1990, unemployment had reached about 20%, and about 60% of the population was living at or below the poverty line. So in this context, with increasing unemployment, increased poverty by the late 1980s, but then more freedom in a sense and more authority by party functionaries and authoritarian elites in the center, this allowed those authoritarian elites to start snapping up the privatization opportunities that this economic reform started to present. Now, at the end of the 1980s, after a decade of the economic crisis, the constitutionalist conflict, and the political disintegration that went along with it, the existing Yugoslav political system was ceasing to function. And the legitimacy of the federal government was being challenged by radical Slovene, Serb, and Croatian nationalism. Now, nevertheless, besides this happening, economic advisors to the Yugoslav government determined that the effectiveness of the program for global integration depended on speed, and the government announced shock therapy stabilization programs to begin in the early 1990s. And the program aimed at no less to completely removing any remaining political barriers to a market economy. So during 1990, even with the clear signs of civil war emerging and hate rhetoric spreading, The federal government continued to attempt to enact the political reforms required by the shock therapy conditions, and it did so under intense pressure from the IMF, which was concerned that the commitment to reform might flag. Now, like I noted before, the structural adjustment policies started to create fractures between ethnic groups and their constituent republics. The ever-increasing number and strength of industrial strikes had in little connection with nationality at the start, including the miners' strike in Kosovo in February 1989, when Serbs and Albanians demonstrated together underground. But by 1990, the class-based industrial unrest in Montenegro and Kosovo had merged with Serb nationalistic protest. The disintegration of institutions, together with increasing poverty, injustice, and social exclusion, stimulated authoritarian coalitions of local political elites and workers into engaging in nationalist and corporatist demands for regional autonomy. Now, commentators on the former Yugoslavia point to a number of conditions that fueled the Republican nationalist dynamic that led to the Bosnian genocide. Those conditions include the destruction of existing federal constitutional arrangements, the destruction of minority rights guarantees, serious unemployment, falling Yugoslav per capita income, the growing role of nationalism in Yugoslavia politics, the role of the military as a political force, and the growing gulf between rich and poor republics. So the economic reasons are really at the center of the dissolution of the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia and the increase in violence that we saw. So now let's look at a summary now of the four major ways that the IMF and its structural adjustment, stabilization, and then later the shock therapy programs can be argued to have contributed to the conditions and to the political destabilization of Yugoslavia. So first, the IMF programs contributed to a sense of insecurity for the people of Yugoslavia and to resulting social instability. The destabilizing consequences of the early IMF austerity programs introduced in the early 1980s, for example, included inflation, falling real incomes, consumer goods shortages, unemployment and the threat of unemployment, abandonment of food subsidies, and rising prices for commodities such as gasoline, heating fuel, and food, which were affected by import restrictions and the push for exports. Second, economically motivated political and constitutional reforms destroyed the means of protecting minority rights within the socialist system. That system of protection had been based upon distribution of government jobs according to national status and state expenditure on cultural rights. More modern commentators now argue that the multiple political arenas that were created by Yugoslavia's extensive political decentralization also operated to guarantee the protection of minority rights and freedoms in the Socialist Republic. These mechanisms for accommodating ethno-national and other differences in socialist Yugoslavia were progressively broken down from 1982 onwards. Now, third, social polarization, attacks on the protection of minority rights, and constitutional and institutional reform resulting from IMF programs contributed to the nationalist dynamic developing during the late 1980s. These programs played a role in the rise of Republican nationalism and the sense that the federal government lacked legitimacy. Critics of IMF programs argued that while Tito's Yugoslavia functioned as a kind of imagined community, that sense of community depended upon the federal government having the ability to provide some level of economic administrative support. When the IMF imposed policies of structural adjustment, it led to the state, as usual, being stripped of most of its functions, except maintaining law and order. People began to look to other sources of community, and in that vacuum, ethnic nationalism re-emerged to provide a new form of community and a needed structure of identity. Now, fourth, the speed with which restructuring and, by 1990, the shock therapy were carried out contributed to the rapid process of political disintegration that began once the Yugoslav crisis entered a nationalist dynamic. The federal government and international institutions remained committed to implementing radical and far-reaching political and constitutional reforms to enable a rapid transition from a socialist economic structure to a purely market-based regime, even after the nationalist climate and violent resistance to those radical reforms became apparent. Now, the genocide in the former Yugoslavia did not, of course, take place without the violence of local actors. The conditions imposed by the IMF and the consequences were, obviously not the sole cause of the outbreak of that violence. Especially like structural adjustment and shock therapy programs had been implemented in many states without leading to such awful violence. But conditions and processes that were required or supported by international institutions here, when combined with the local responses in Yugoslavia, led to increased and abhorrent violence. And responsibility for that violence belongs to both international and local actors and not to local actors alone. Now, the 1995 Dayton Peace Agreement, which ended the Bosnian War, called for the introduction of the neoliberal economic model through a depoliticized discourse of necessary reform. So there was a continuation of what was already being set up in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. The envisioned Bosnian state at Dayton, as promulgated by the international community and excluding Bosnian input too, had conditional sovereignty, and they had to accord to European Union policy priorities. For the World Bank and the IMF, both privatization and marketization were non-negotiable conditions of Bosnia's post-conflict development and were codified in the Bosnian constitution imposed at Dayton, which even stipulated that the IMF would initially appoint the governor of the Bosnian Central Bank, who could not be Bosnian. Indeed, Bosnia had to abide by an externally driven agenda at the end of the war, not only because it had an external debt of nearly $4 billion and was thus dependent on financing from the World Bank and the IMF, but also due to the constitutional creation of the Office of the High Representative, which was a non-elected European Union citizen who held and still holds unaccountable viceroy-like power over Bosnian politics, who could dismiss elected Bosnians and institute laws which were binding at will. Now, we'll come back to the significance of these post-conflict reforms in Bosnia at the start of the Week 7 lecture and what this tells us about the evolution of neoliberalism in the mid-1990s. Now, elsewhere, the IMF, the World Bank, and Western reformers were also implementing economic shock therapy, and mainly in the former Soviet Union. And as we spoke about at in Lecture 1, the pinnacle of capitalist triumph was the collapse of the USSR, as the event marked the point where neoliberal relations could truly reach deeply into every corner of the globe. And indeed, neoliberal hegemony beginning in the 1980s and 1990s can only be understood through the dissolution of the USSR and the movement of constituting regional economies towards capital relations. This historic event engendered a reinvigorated sense of Western and especially United States neoliberal triumphalism, radical economic restructuring programs, and a period of human suffering and despair that has had no parallel outside of major wars. Now, as the constituent states of the USSR declared independence in the early 1990s, there was a perverse rush to privatize and marketize the now open former Soviet economies. The neoliberal explorers who entered this region and the World Bank and the IMF who launched themselves into the dissolving USSR evinced little to no understanding of the Soviet system they attempted to reform. Now, Western advisors sought out new avenues of capital in the Wild East, in alliance with ex-Soviet reformers who had quite easily made the transition from Communist Party functionaries to the nouveau capitalists in the East, and who were supported by the World Bank and IMF and major Western governments. They all sought to prescribe neoliberal structural packages for all emerging national economies in the region. Now, these reform packages were heavily criticized for the lost decade of structural adjustment in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that we touched on last week. But they were still applied in the former Soviet Union without hesitation. And we can summarize these measures as the liberalization of prices, macroeconomic stabilization, including deflationary measures, privatization of state enterprises, abolition of central economic control, removal of barriers to free international trade and investment, destruction of Comecon, and the elimination of universal social protection. Now, such was the neoliberal triumphalism and dominance at the time that the only question as to how to proceed with these Washington consensus measures was between implementing these measures quickly or gradually. The Big Bang option won out, and that was preferred. And so shock therapy was born in the former Soviet Union. We'll turn to the impacts of shock therapy in Ukraine shortly, but even today, there's been very variegated or differential outcomes to the post-Soviet economic transformation, which we can still see today. Some states, such as Poland, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, and other Central European states, have arguably fared much better in terms of their purely macroeconomic indicators, though significant pain still occurred for a lot of the population in this transition. Whereas the central core of the Soviet Union, that central indicator we mentioned in the first lecture, such as Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, fared much worse. The general argument that explains this discrepancy is that the Central European states implemented shock therapy much more quickly, while the Eastern European post-Soviet states were too slow, which impacted their development. Thinking of the explanation being, the necessity of ripping a Band-Aid off quickly. Now, this doesn't really stand up to serious scrutiny. We can't go into this in a huge amount of detail, but just as a few examples to demonstrate this point, Poland, who was a top performer in many Western assessments, was the only country in the region that had most of its debts wiped, while Russia and Ukraine, the region's failures, actually implemented shock therapy programs at alarming speeds, which were just as fast and ferocious as in other countries, which we'll note quite soon, especially in Ukraine. And much of the difference in eventual macroeconomic factors such as GDP and growth can maybe be more accurately attributed to increased economic integration between the former Soviet Central European states with the wealthy Western Europe, the usefulness of the exports to Western Europe, and the assistance that was granted to them by European and international institutions, all of which was mostly absent for the post-Soviet Eastern states such as Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, inclusive of those in Central Asia. Now, as I noted, substantial evidence demonstrates that shock therapy produced intolerable pain and suffering throughout Eastern Europe, with the well-being of the populace worse than the final crumbling years of the USSR. To illustrate, between 1989 and 1993, there were 800,000 excess deaths in the region attributable to the economic transition, as per a report from UNICEF, with the crude death rate increasing in Ukraine just by itself by over 10%. In Ukraine, there was gross decline in food and nutrient consumption, decreased calorie intake by nearly 20%, shorter life expectancy, and the birth rate collapsed by 20% as a diphtheria epidemic exploded. Now we're going to look more into Ukraine in these early years, which would be quite short. And we're looking at Ukraine not only because it's a research interest of mine, but also because it's a country that's often forgotten about in the post-Soviet transition, with most of the focus on Russia. But looking at Ukraine now will also be important for when we start thinking about the war in Ukraine in many weeks later into the course. Now, as I noted, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a flood of Western reformers alongside the IMF and the World Bank introduced economic restructuring in Ukraine based on Washington Consensus principles. Now, as soon as these measures are implemented with the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, the breaking off of the strong economic relations between the constituent Soviet republics, Ukraine immediately experienced soaring hyperinflation, which reached nearly 1,000% by 1992, which caused a swift decline in Ukrainian living standards, with the majority of consumer purchasing power focused towards just basic necessities to survive, with 40% of people living below the poverty line. Official price liberalization efforts began in 1992, even at hyperinflation soaring at that time, which deepened the crisis and increased food prices by nearly 1,700% in 1992 alone, which was seen as a positive by Western reformers at that time. Now, due to inflation, workers lost more than 2/3 of their wages between 1992 and 1994, and prices continued to rise between 5,000 to 10,000-fold in the first phase of reforms. Further privatization progressed extremely quickly with the establishment of institutions which forced this issue, with 11,000 enterprises privatized in this phase. Controls on foreign direct investment were removed, which opened up Ukraine's economy to rapid flows of capital. By 1997, the privatization of small-scale enterprises and most large and medium-sized enterprises were effectively completed. And in this privatization, there was a scheme where Ukrainians would receive certificates as nominal shareholders in the privatization process as a means to try to include Ukrainians in privatization. So it wasn't all snapped up by the increasing oligarchic post-Communist Party class or foreign investors. Now, privatization made approximately 15 million Ukrainian citizens shareholders, which was seen as a fair and equitable distribution of wealth by the World Bank. However, an architect of the privatization program admitted that these shares were illusory, consisting of only a few shares that could not be traded, returned no yield, and offered no influence whatsoever. Real power in the privatization process actually lay with the former elite Communist Party members who were now transitioning to the as oligarchs in this new capitalist economy who snapped up property and assets. And then price liberalization also continued in this period as the price of bread and public transport increased by 150 and 367% respectively in just 1 year in 1995. The heightened price of goods, exploding household costs, decreasing wages, and downsizing of the public sector contributed to an upsurge in poverty, particularly impacting women who made up most of the redundancies. Due to the liberalization efforts of the IMF and the World Bank in Ukraine, the share market became the major source of financing for the budget in 1997. But this immediately imploded as a result of a collapse in investor confidence in many developing economies, which stemmed from the Asian financial crisis. Now, with that segue, the Asian financial crisis, and we're moving at a rapid pace here, befit of the 1990s, the Asian financial crisis was a major event in the 1990s, with shocks spreading all over the world. And as I mentioned, it even hit post-Soviet Ukraine and Russia in a big way. Now, we're going to briefly touch on the Asian financial crisis, but just to summarize the 1990s for Ukraine, and keep in mind this is especially so for Russia, Ukraine was at the center of a post-Soviet humanitarian tragedy that had no parallel outside major wars, with inequality, unemployment, and excess deaths plaguing the region, which would have intense ramifications for the next 30 years. Now, we continue to retrospectively assess the 1990s as continued violence, increasing economic collapses proliferated across the world, and no more so in terms of economic crisis than the Asian financial crisis. And we haven't really spoken too much about some of the East Asian economies after World War II, but there had been a long post-World War II sequence of economic miracles in Japan, the newly industrialized economies of Asia, the NIEs, so South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, the ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, and even then more recently, China. And that attracted the interest of development economists across the entire political spectrum. East Asia was widely admired as the only region where the barriers to late industrialization had been overcome, and the miracle economies were widely held up as models for other less developed countries. For example, the World Bank in its 1993 report, The Asian Miracle, basked in the glow of this success. And throughout ruling circles, the Asian model was touted as proof that open markets and the free flow of capital would be the salvation of humankind. Now, within a few years, the East Asian miracle states were suddenly in a collapse, which was called the Asian financial crisis. During this collapse, every day, 10,000 South Korean workers received layoff notices at about 300,000 per month. The Indonesian economy was in a state of near total collapse, with only about 20 of the nearly 300 companies on the Jakarta Stock Exchange still viable. Japan was mired in its deepest recession in 25 years. Malaysia and Thailand were in financial shock, and more than $600 billion had been wiped off the balance sheet of the region's stock markets. Now, we'll now survey a few different theoretical explanations for the East Asian miracle before we then go into the collapse in more detail. Now, neoliberalism is the dominant approach not only to understanding the East Asian experience, but really to all international economic developments. Its advocates argue that the economic success of Japan, newly industrialized East Asian states and the ASEAN was due to the governments having allowed comparative advantage in international trade to direct the allocation of productive resources. By creating stable, non-inflationary, and open economic environments, governments encourage domestic firms to take advantage of low unit labor costs and engage in labor-intensive export-oriented production. The focus on exports enabled firms to overcome inadequate domestic demand and reap increasing returns to scale and associated learning by doing effects from greater production. With productivity rising faster than real wages, East Asian countries were able to secure rapid increases in output and employment without threatening their low unit labor costs and export competitiveness. This process of export-driven growth was further enhanced by government commitment to relatively loose restrictions and realistic taxation rates on export-oriented foreign capital. Such commitment was especially important to the ASEAN countries, such as Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore, which enabled them to attract foreign direct investment as required to overcome the natural market imperfections that otherwise hindered development of technology, finance, and marketing, such as transactions and information costs. Now, structural institutionalists, which is a slightly different view, sometimes called liberal institutionalists, have criticized the neoliberal approach for its failure to recognize how East Asian states actively shaped the investment and trade activity, and especially in Japan and the newly industrialized Eastern countries, such as South Korea, for instance. The success of such industrial policies contradicted neoliberalism's starting assumption of a given set of comparative advantages. Among the state interventions commonly cited are investment and export subsidies, protection of newer industries and enterprises from imports in exchange for their achievement of export targets, government control over the sectoral and enterprise allocation of credit, and strategic planning of the new industrial activities to be developed, which often entailed a leading role for state enterprises. Like neoliberals, structural institutionalists still emphasize the need for technical upgrading to deal with competition from lower wage countries. But unlike neoliberals, they suggest that planned import substitution, industrialization, and export-led growth are not competing, but rather complementary means of achieving this goal. Although the right combination of rewards and penalties, or through the right combination of rewards and penalties, governments can engineer a maturation of protected infant industries into dynamic, globally competitive firms and sectors. And on the face of it, structural institutionalism clearly appears more accurate in this case than neoliberalism. Government policies in the miracle countries, especially Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, bore really little resemblance to the neoliberals' preferred free market regime and had a lot of state support for their industries. Now, dependency theorists analyze the miracle economies here and focus on the development of a hierarchically structured regional system of export-oriented industry featuring highly unequal distribution of value added between Japanese and then the peripheral enterprises. Dependencies analysis recognize that the degree and pattern of external domination differ between the newly industrialized economies of Taiwan, South Korea, and the ASEAN countries of Malaysia and Thailand and so forth. One striking difference is the relative absence of a significant import substitution base in the ASEAN countries. But even in South Korea and Taiwan, key manufacturing sectors, including the all-important electronics industry, still rely heavily on imports of essential components and machinery from Japan. This technological and marketing dependence was manifested in original equipment manufacturing arrangements with Japanese firms and in the increasing resort to sales in lower-rung markets in peripheral countries, not as yet fully mined by core country firms. And such dependency effects were more severe in the ASEAN 3, mainly because the ASEAN 3's export-oriented manufacturing was more of the product of the explosion of investment from Japan and even from South Korea and Taiwan than any of the national industrialization projects that were generated from within in the ASEAN 3 of Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. And it therefore was characterized by extremely high shares of manufactured exports produced by or under the control of foreign companies, especially Japanese ones, and by a relative absence of local linkages between these foreign-based exporters and locally controlled firms. So East Asia's dependence on Japanese business, was reinforced then by Japanese aid and lending policies on the view of the dependency theorists. Besides helping to finance the import bills associated with export-led industrialization, Japan's development aid is kind of comparable to other core countries, which was like the US and the UK and other European imperial powers, which is highly integrated with the strategic goals of Japanese transnational firms in terms of the industrial location, the primary product production, and importation. And the Japanese money was also largely directed towards infrastructural projects which supported Japanese export-orientated operations. So this dependency theory saw the dominance of Japan in the region as a key reason for the buildup of these more peripheral economies. Now, the actual crisis itself. Now, contrary to the descriptions of the business press at that particular time, critical political economists tend to argue that the collapse in East Asia was not fundamentally about, corruption, crony capitalism, or overly regulated markets. Rather, it was about the classic problem of capitalist overaccumulation and the profit squeeze that accompanies it. The enormous capital flows into Southeast Asia in recent years contributed to a huge buildup in productive capacity, much of which could not be profitably utilized. Capitalist development of the forces of production, in other words, ran up against its inherent limits, especially as Marxists would say. Yet as market competition intensified, corporations responded by adding even more new capacity, such as new factories, mines, mills, and mega farms, new infrastructure and service industries. Adding more capacity at a time of general overcapacity may seem irrational from a broader view, and for the system as a whole, it certainly is. But for the individual capitalist firm that was caught in the logic of market competition, it's the only rational course. Because the objective, after all, is to ensure that someone else fails in the scramble for market share. You've got to keep producing and capture new areas and factories and produce more to survive. And then the survivors are likely to be those with the right combination of lean production, new technology, labor discipline, low wages, and ready market access. So new capacity is added to achieve these, to construct the most efficient capitalist enterprise, and despite the problem of overaccumulation as a whole. And arguably, the root cause of the Asian economic crisis was downward pressure on prices and profits that were brought on by overproduction. So, producing too much stuff, there's a lot of stuff out there, and so it decreases the value of it. That's why that investors sensed that there was an inadequate return on further investment in the Southeast Asian sector, and then they got cold feet. They began to hedge their bets by reducing their East Asian holdings, and slowly but surely, they pulled out money in key areas where increased accumulation, which had been exacerbated by huge inflows of speculative capital, had previously been the order of the day. So market forces responded, in other words, as the profitability decreased in East Asian tigers and these dynamic East Asian economies. They responded to real problems of this overaccumulation of capital. Rather than a result of inadequate marketization of society. The Asian crisis is actually all about the contradictions that were inherent in the capitalist market. In short, it's like a product of capitalist globalization, of the extension and intensification of capitalist contradictions on a world scale. And this kind of increasing crisis of overproduction and overaccumulation in East Asia was exacerbated further by these flows of short-term financial capital that I mentioned before. Because at this time, and we didn't really talk about this too much, but in the 1980s, Latin American markets remained very shaky after the huge debt crises there. And Japan's stock and real estate markets were also melting down by the late 80s. So international banks and lending agencies actually saw the great profits that may be made in the late 80s. They saw, these factories going up, as I mentioned before, new technologies being brought on, explosive growth of infrastructure like highways, airports, telecommunication systems, luxury hotels, and they wanted in on this boom. So finance capital poured into the region, making it relatively cheap and easy to raise funds. And then manufacturing construction firms kept bringing new projects online. So East Asia's economic upswing acquired a classic characteristic of a speculative boom, even though some more long-term investors started to pull out their money as they started to realize that it was predicated on very shaky foundations. Now, as each new mega project was announced to euphoric prediction, the speculative bubble grew larger. And inevitably, some investors started to more seriously bet against this euphoria. They recognized that too many factories, agribusinesses, mines, hotels, and highways were being built in a context of overcapacity. So quietly, like I mentioned, they started to withdraw from new investment projects in Asia. They pulled cash out of the stock markets. They dumped Asian currencies. Now, once this started occurring and it started to pick up as a pattern, it snowballed. Previously, the private capital flows into Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand had quintupled between 1990 and 1996, which soared from 20 billion to nearly 100 billion per year. Those countries suddenly experienced in 1997 a net outflow of private capital to the tune of $20 billion. And while the success of the SEA3, which is Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, in exporting manufacturers, especially to the US, was widely celebrated, the underlying process was highly exploitative and unstable. Most of the exports were produced under foreign, largely Japanese control, as I mentioned. And for example, in Malaysia at the end of the 1980s, foreign-controlled companies accounted for approximately 99% of electronics exports, over 90% of the exports of machinery and electrical appliances, over 80% of the exports of rubber goods, and 75% of textiles and apparel exports. This foreign-dominated industrialization did, for a time, lower poverty rates and create a growing middle class, but it came at a high cost for the great majority of working people in these countries. The dependency that I noted meant that while Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia ran surpluses in their trade with the United States, they ran far bigger deficits in their trade with Japan. In 1992, for example, Thailand ran nearly a $3 billion trade surplus with the US, but a nearly $8.5 billion trade deficit with Japan. And the faster these countries grew, the larger were their overall trade deficits. And that they started to have huge issues in paying off their debt. And faced with these major trade deficits, the SEA3 governments, which Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand, remained under constant pressure to generate additional foreign exchange because failure meant basically the collapse of their economies. And despite the high rates of growth, they found it necessary to support further growth by smashing workers' attempts at unionization, encouraging the inflow of cheaper migrant workers to alleviate wage pressures, and continue the high-speed exploitation of natural resources. And another means by which these countries were able to cover their trade deficits, at least from 1986 through to 1990, was through basically Japanese foreign direct investment. As we mentioned before, the Japanese investment was crucial for these countries. Before the Asian financial crisis, Japanese foreign direct investment in Thailand and Malaysia started to decline. And this was in conjunction with the Japanese economy cooling down in the early 90s. So in Thailand, for instance, the Japanese investment fell from nearly 2.5 billion to 500 million, 2.5 billion in 1990 to 500 million in 1993. It wasn't that Japan was necessarily giving up on Asia, but Japanese corporations were shifting their focus to China and Vietnam, which were countries with even lower wages and bigger domestic markets. Now, left short of foreign exchange because of these shifts in Japanese priorities, the Thai, Malaysian, and to a slightly lesser extent, the Indonesian governments aggressively pursued other sources of foreign exchange, and particular loans and other short-term financial investments. And the Philippines government started to follow their lead because they didn't want to be left behind. These four governments courted foreign investors by dropping their foreign exchange controls, opening their stock markets, pegging their currencies to the dollar, raising interest rates, and creating new opportunities for foreign banks to make dollar-denominated loans to local businesses. And their timing was quite good initially. The recession and low interest rates in the developed capitalist world generated substantial interest on the part of investment houses and international banks in the emerging markets of Southeast Asia. Billions of dollars flowed into Southeast Asian stock bond markets. Billions more were borrowed by Southeast Asian banks and firms. And so the rapid growth of the SEA3 was sustained, but at a cost. And a case in point, Thailand, the finance companies there borrowed approximately 50 billion over a 3-year period beginning in 1993 to sustain the economy. And as a result, as I noted, the country's foreign debt started to soar. And so it got up to nearly 90 billion by 1996. And little of the new money that came into these countries went into productive investments. In the case of Thailand, again, finance companies re-lent a large percentage of the money to property developers. And by late 1995, just before the financial crisis, as might be expected, given the very unbalanced nature of wealth in Thailand, there was a glut of constructing high-end commercial and residential units. But then by the beginning of 1997, almost half of all loans made to property developers were non-performing. Thai finance companies and banks began to default on their foreign loans, and not although not quite as far advanced along that path, a similar process with similar results was underway in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Now, growing increasingly concerned for the safety of their investments, foreign investors now wanted totally out of the region. Adding to their concern was uncertainty over whether Southeast Asian central banks had sufficient dollars to cover the investor withdrawals at the pegged exchange rate that they had. And this concern was fueled by the fact that the region's export offensive was losing steam. Now, Thailand was the first miracle country to suffer the consequences of the financial crisis. Foreign investors raced to unload their stocks and bonds, which drove down the market and call in their dollar loans. Speculators soon joined. The government jacked up interest rates and ran through reserves, trying to protect the currency, but it couldn't slow the rush for dollars. It was finally forced to abandon its pegged exchange rate. The Thai currency, the baht, quickly fell in value, which only stimulated more selling and speculation, pushing domestic stock and bond markets and the currency down further. Then investors and speculators turned their attention to Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, which much the same result. In order to avert a complete economic meltdown, Thailand and Indonesia were forced to ask the IMF for assistance and in return accepted an IMF structural adjustment program. All eyes turned next to South Korea. East Asia's major industrial power outside of Japan now appeared terribly vulnerable, especially in light of the downward slide of the value of the Japanese yen brought on by Japan's current crisis. Now, since South Korea companies compete directly with Japan in industries like cars, steel, and electronics, it had much to fear from the declining prices for Japanese exports that a lower Japanese currency, the yen, created. South Korea then found itself in a conundrum. Despite its booming export growth, its export revenues were stagnating as a result of downward pressure on prices. So just before the Asian financial crisis, for example, South Korea exports actually rose by nearly 40%, but the export revenues crept up only by a mere 5%. So these meager increases were not adequate to finance the borrowing that Korean businesses had done to build and retool factories. By the end of 1996, the top 30 chaebol, or the industrial conglomerates that dominated the economy, had an average debt-to-equity ratio of 400%, so they had a lot of debt. As the crisis hit and exports and earnings slumped, prospects for financing those debts reduced dramatically. Now, more than 1/4 of the chaebol then collapsed, including the automotive giant Kia and the Harlow Group, which were involved in shipbuilding, engineering, and auto parts. Now, meanwhile, the crisis in East Asia then fed back into Japan, where it kind of arguably started. The Japanese slump began in the early 1990s with huge collapses in stock and real estate markets. And after contracting about 1% in 1997, Japanese output slumped a staggering nearly 6% in the first quarter of 1998 as the Asian financial crisis was really kicking off. Corporate profits and capital investment were down, business bankruptcies were soaring, and consumer spending was in a deep funk. Department store sales were falling at a rate of nearly 20% each month. Now, not only in Japan and East Asia, but the Asian financial crisis also traveled all the way to Russia and Ukraine, which affected the confidence of international investors in Eastern Europe, causing more economic pain to that region. Now, in East Asia, more than 5 million Indonesian workers were laid off between 1997 and 1998. There was nearly 3 million unemployed in Thailand, almost 2 million sacked in South Korea, and 1 million unemployed in Malaysia, alongside 1.5 million migrant laborers being expelled. In concert with the layoffs went the destruction of living standards. Between August and December of 1997, average incomes halved in South Korea. And then in Indonesia, annual per capita income plummeted from $1,200 a year to $300. So these huge reductions in living standards really hurt the working people in East Asian states. Now, the IMF came to the rescue. It imposed the same basic structural adjustment programs on Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea as well, ignoring both its celebration and the contradictory nature of the East Asian growth strategy. It blamed the crisis on crony capitalism, using that very neoliberal explanation for what happened. Now, it demanded that these governments maintain high interest rates to attract funds and thus defend their currencies, cut spending and growth to reduce incomes and imports, gut social programs and weaker labor rights further to lower labor costs and thus promote exports, and privatize, reduce tariffs, and end restrictions on foreign ownership of financial and non-financial businesses in order to attract foreign investment. So very much still the Washington consensus dictum of neoliberalism at this stage. Now, that's all that I wanted to touch on for the Asian financial crisis, which was just a brief overview of some of the theoretical explanations, what happened, and also just a sneak peek of how it affected Eastern Europe. Next week, we'll begin by addressing the fallout of the Asian financial crisis, the Bosnian War, and the post-Soviet economic restructuring that we've touched on, and how it influenced and changed neoliberal thought. We'll then address the early 2000s, including the war on terror, the food and fuel crises in the context of commodity booms, and then finally the global financial crisis. So we keep it exciting, and I hope you're enjoying things and learning lots, and I'll see you in tutorials. Thank you, everyone.